Okay, anyway, that's okay. We're not yet into we're just into the steps. So again, there are similar steps, okay, the same steps for graphing a polynomial like intercepts, domain, and sign chart. But what one more step is needed for graphing a polynomial, or sorry, a rational function? There's one additional step that is needed. Anyone? Yes, asymptotes. And there are two, vertical and horizontal. And how do we get the vertical and horizontal asymptotes? We will do that for this example. But first, let us enumerate some of the steps. So step one usually is this is the step of finding the domain. And for the domain, you just have to observe the denominator. So that should be easy, no radicals involved, because this is a rational function. It's a ratio of two polynomials, and a polynomial does not have a radical. So just exclude that value. All real numbers, you can just write it simply in this form. And then intercepts, you already know how to get the intercepts. And sorry for not being able to write well, although I really do not write well since I'm just Indian sitting here on my bed. Anyway, so intercepts. And there are two, x-intercepts and y-intercepts. And just to review, to get the x-intercepts, you have to set y to 0. And that means since you're considering a rational function, you have to know how to find the zeros of this one, since you might, okay, equate the denominator to 0 as well. Well, remember, the denominator cannot be 0. You cannot divide by 0. So for this to be 0, it's the numerator that has to be 0. Okay? Or you can cross multiply and you get 0 times x minus 1, that's 0. X plus 1 times 1 is x plus 1, same thing. Numerator equals 0. So you get negative 1. And instead of writing x-intercept, then y-intercept or intercepts, you can just write, okay, negative 1, 0. And then the y-intercept. And remember, there is at most one y-intercept. As explained in a previous video, you cannot cross the y-intercept more than once. You can cross, or the graph can cross, the x-intercept many times, depending on the degree of the polynomial function. But if it's a rational function, okay, by the way, for this one, you cannot cross the y-intercept more than once. Because if that were so, then we would not have a function. Remember, by virtue of the vertical line test, this one is not a function. Okay, you get what I mean here. If it has two y-intercepts, say this one here and another here, and by the vertical line test, it fails to be a function. That's why there is no more than one y-intercept. And also, it's possible that there's no y-intercept at all if we're dealing with rational functions where, okay, there are values where it is undefined. So particularly if the rational function is undefined at the origin or at x equals 0, so that it has no y value there, then there will be no y-intercept. Okay, and that will happen if upon substitution of 0 for x, you get an undefined number, but not in this case though. So here's the function. remember, to get the y-intercept, you set x to 0. So 0 plus 1 over 0 minus 1. And you also get negative 1. So that another point you have to put here is the point 0, negative 1. Now, just to give you an example of a rational function that does not have a y-intercept, you can consider like x plus 1, simply this one, over x. To get the y-intercept, remember, you have to set x to 0. So if you do that, 0 plus 1 over 0, this is 1 over 0. That's not defined. So therefore, this has no y-intercept. So again, rational function will have no y-intercept if it is undefined at 0, or rather 0 is not part of the domain of the function. Back to this one. So next step would be to, in addition to the other steps for graphing polynomials, now the vertical the asymptotes. And you may want to separate the steps for getting the the vertical ones and then the horizontal one. There's at most one horizontal asymptote, but there could be many vertical asymptotes. But let me do it in one, they call this step here. So instead of separating, let's just enumerate all the asymptotes. So first, the vertical ones. To get the VAs, okay, let's just abbreviate that to VA for vertical asymptote. To get the VAs, all you have to do, anyone can tell me how to get the vertical ones? Equate the denominator, okay? So if you look at the denominator here, you just equate it to 0. And you get x equals 1. That gives you the equation itself of the vertical asymptote. You have to put x equals 1. You have to put the x. Now, what if you put only 1? Sir, the vertical asymptote is 1. You're wrong. What is 1? It's just a real number. Unless you're giving me the x-intercept and one is one of the x-intercepts, then if you put 1 here, I understand that you're referring to the point 1, 0. But for this one, it has no meaning if you're referring to a line. So you have to write the equation of the vertical line. X equals 1. Remember, a vertical line has an equation x equals c. Okay, so how does this line look like? Just for the sake of those who might still be confused with how come this one is an equation, or yes, an equation of a line which is vertical. If you try to plot all the points that satisfy x equals 1, just a review, you can give points that satisfy this equation. Like you have 1, 0, right? Sorry, baliktad, 0, 1. This point satisfies this equation because baliktad, 1, 0 pala, no? Because its x coordinate is 1. You can also have 2, 0, 1, 0. Tama na ba to? 2, 0. Okay. That's why. Sorry. I'm thinking too fast. I edit myself. So dapat pala y equals 1. Oh, sorry, what's happening to me? Wait. X equals 1. Tama, ano? So kung x equals 1, yung x coordinate, 1, 0. Has to be this. Okay. All right. Sorry. Got confused. So 1, 0, and then 1, 2, or 1, 1. Can have 1, 2, 1, 3. As long as the x coordinate is 1, then it satisfies this equation. And if you collect all such points, you will come up with a vertical line. And that's why this is an equation of a vertical line. So that means in giving me, or in writing down the vertical and horizontal asymptotes, you have to write down the equation. X equals 1. Now next, how do we get the horizontal asymptotes? Anyone? For this one, you may need to unmute your microphone because there are several things you have to consider. Or you can just give me some particular thing to look at. What do we have to look at when we are looking for, or when we are finding, all right, the horizontal asymptote, if there is any?
Sure.
Yes?
We have to compare the degrees of the numerator and
Yes, very good. You have to compare the degrees. And there are 3 possible scenarios, right? Whether the degree of the numerator is less, equal to, or greater than the denominators. Now, in this case, I won't be writing down those steps though, since you are required to study the material beforehand. So I will just be considering this particular case here for now, for this particular example. If you compare their degrees, the numerator has degree 1, the denominator has degree 1. So they are equal in degree. The degree of the numerator equals the degree of the denominator. And when that is so, how do you get the equation of the horizontal asymptote? Anyone?
Sir, I think it's the leading coefficient ng parang it's the leading coefficients of the numerator over the leading coefficient of the denominator.
Yeah.
So it's
Okay,
1
tama.
over.
So you divide. So what's the leading coefficient of the numerator? 1. And what's the leading coefficient of the denominator? 1. And what you do is divide those two. 1 divided by 1 is 1. So that's the equation, but you have to put in the y. So this one will be a horizontal line that intersects the y-axis at 1. Okay, and also the vertical asymptote at 1. And why do we call them asymptotes? Anyone? Why are they called asymptotes? What relationship do these lines have to the graph itself? Anyone? Kaya di ba mayroon tayong word na asymptotic? Anong ibig sabihin nun? Okay. Let me call. Mr. Crisologo. Are you here?
Yes, sir.
Can you tell me, can you define to me or describe to me rather, kasi hindi natin ma-define dahil kailangan natin ng numerical table doon or more mathematically precise way of stating it or writing it. So can you just describe to me what an asymptote is, or why it is, or why an asymptote is an asymptote?
Sir, they are lines that a function will approach but never intersect with.
Okay, you have the idea there, but not so precisely stated, because the graph may really intersect the asymptote, not the vertical ones, but the horizontal one. So halimbawa, ito yung coordinate axis mo, and this is your horizontal asymptote. It's possible to cross the horizontal asymptote with it still being asymptotic to the graph, or the graph as being asymptotic to it. Ganyan. But you can never cross the vertical asymptotes because the function is not defined at those values of x. Okay. Diba? We get the vertical asymptote by equating the denominator to 0, and the values, or the zeros rather, of the denominator make the function undefined. Excluded sila lagi sa domain. So that means there's no point there at x equals 1, and so the graph cannot cross the vertical asymptote here. Okay, wala kasi siyang point sa 1. Hindi siya defined sa 1. So pag nag-cross ka dyan, para mo na rin sinabing, uy, may point pala doon sa graph sa x equals 1. And wala sa domain yun, di ba? So back to the steps here. So asymptotes, we call them as such because the function will approach them. Rather, graphically. Graphically, we say that the graph of the function approaches the asymptotes, or gets closer and closer to the asymptote as you go indefinitely in some direction, and at that direction the graph will not cross the asymptote, will not touch. So even with horizontal asymptotes, like say this is a horizontal asymptote, it may cross it once, twice, thrice, or many times, but eventually there will come a time when it will not cross it anymore. It can only cross it a finite number of times, and after that, the graph will just get closer and closer and closer and closer, but will not touch it. So that's what he meant a while ago. So finally, we have the sign chart again. It's usually always the last one you have to do. So you already know how to construct a sign chart. And you just equate both numerator and denominator this time to 0, since you're getting the partition numbers, right? When you're doing the sign chart, you get all partition numbers and they come from both numerator and denominator. So you have -1, 1. And then just test a number. Now don't forget, you have to put a 0 at 1 and an ND at baligtad. A 0 at -1, 0 kasi yun. And then an ND at 1. Kasi hindi siya defined doon. And with this sign chart, actually, it would now be easy to sketch the graph of this rational function. But before that, since this is just a problem solving, or rather assertion on solving exercises, let me right away give you the easy way, okay, of sketching the graph. And all you have to do is consider the 4 graphs or shapes I will be drawing here. Yan. Take a look at them well. Try to memorize them in your mind. Okay. And just pick one of those 4. And that depends which side of the vertical asymptote you're considering. So let's say this is the vertical asymptote, and you're on the left side of the vertical asymptote, then it's one of these 2. And if you're on the right side, it's one of these 2. I hope you memorize those shapes. Excuse me for a moment. Now, next. Let's draw the Cartesian, or rather, yes, the Cartesian plane, the XY plane. And then you plot all points available, the intercepts. So we have the x-intercept at 1. And we have the y-intercept. Baligtad, parehong -1. Ayan. This is the x-intercept, and this is the y-intercept. So you know that the graph has to cross those points somehow. And then next, you draw your asymptotes. X equals 1, y equals 1. And it's better if you use a colored pen, or if you don't have a colored pen, use dotted lines or dashed lines. So halimbawa black lang yung color mo, ganyan na lang. Pero I'll use a different color so we can see clearly that this one is the vertical asymptote and this one the horizontal asymptote. So you know the graph will be asymptotic to those lines. And as I have said, there are only 4 possibilities. Okay, burahin ko muna. So if we try to draw the 2 possibilities on the left-hand side, or at the left-hand side of the vertical asymptote here, you know there are only 2 ways of drawing it on this side. Okay, but of course these 2 points are parts of the graph, so we have to really make it cross. Now, based on the sign chart, which do you think should be the one of the 2? Is it the upper one or the lower one? Anyone? And explain why. Is it the upper one or the lower one? Mr. Idquival, are you here?
Hello, sir.
Yes.
I think it's the lower one.
Why? Give me one reason.
I think it's the lower one because the points are there na kasi. So there's like x-intercept,
Yes,
that's
that's one
y-intercept is also there.
Now, based on the
Yes.
sign chart, also, why should it be the lower one? Based on the sign chart.
I guess it goes from up to down po, I think.
Up
So it's
above,
up
above
above.
the x-axis, and then
And
below.
then it goes down the x-axis po.
Yes.
Oo.
If we pick this one, it will always be above the x-axis, right?
Yes po.
Thank you very much. Now, to be able to be below, you need the other one. It has to be the other one. So above the x-axis, up to -1, right? And then after that, below.
Okay.
Below entirely now, up to 1. And asymptotic. So you have to draw it so that it's getting closer and closer to those asymptotes. But anyway, let me redraw it later. Dapat palapit siya.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Now, for the other side, on the other side here, you only have two possibilities. Which one should be it? Anyone else? Unless I call somebody, pwedeng mag-volunteer. The lower one, Mr. Samson, ito, iba to na. Okay, the upper one. Why? Can you explain? Please unmute your microphone.
Sir, since the sign chart says everything above 1 should be positive.
Yes. It has to be above entirely. This one has some portion above, but it's not entirely above. Some part of it is below. So it has to be this one. So we delete that. And we have a rough sketch. Okay, let me show it to you using GeoGebra. Okay, let's graph, plot, put in the expression. There. And let me show you the asymptotes. Let me plot the vertical asymptote, x equals 1. And then the horizontal asymptote, y equals 1. And notice the graph does approach the asymptotes, although hindi ganun kakita dahil hindi nakascale ito eh. So it's hard to really see the ends. We do zoom out, yan siya. Hindi nagtatouch yan, ano? Asymptotic lang yung graph dyan. Okay, so tama tayo. The lower one dun sa left side ng vertical, and then the upper one dun sa right side ng vertical. Okay, another example. Okay, I will just be giving you the values, okay, the intercepts, the domain, and then we'll just discuss how to find the asymptotes. So domain, to get the domain, you have to factor out the denominator. So it cannot be 0. So you know that the domain is the set of all real numbers except -1 and 2. And those turn out to be our vertical asymptotes also. But you have to write as an equation. Intercepts. By the way, you get partial points for giving the domain, the intercepts, for completing the steps. If this were a file upload question, and if you don't give the domain, even if you got everything else correct, then you lose the point allotted to that. So I have to see this. So intercepts. So equate the numerator to 0 to get the x-intercepts, or just 1 in this case. And equate y to 0. So you have to make this 0. Again. Yeah, correct. Pareho lang, ano? So 0 pala x. So 1/2. Set x to 0. 1/2 ang makukuha. And then for the asymptotes, for the vertical ones, yung denominator, titignan mo lang. Don't write like this, x equals to -1. You're giving me solutions to an equation. Rather, you have to separate them. These are two different lines. Now, by the way, siguro isingit ko na rin dito just a caution or a precaution. Sometimes students, teachers may give you a trick question, or perhaps this might just be one of the items in the midterms or in the quiz, and you're just to give the asymptotes. Say this is the given function. And the question is, enumerate the vertical asymptotes. And as told, you equate the denominator to 0, right? Giving you 2. And you give these 2 as answers. And you get wrong. Why? Because one of them is not really a vertical asymptote. Why? Anyone? Ditin ko, in-equate mo sa 0 to, makukuha mo 2, but isa lang dyan talaga yung vertical asymptote. Why? Anyone can explain to me why? Miss Mangubat,
Sir,
like to answer?
I'm
Yes.
not sure po of the answer.
Okay, you're not sure. That's okay, though. But anyway, anyone knows, just in case, before I explain why? You factor out first. Notice there's a common factor, which if you cancel out, would only give you 1/x plus 1. And they are equivalent almost, except for x equals -1. Oh, sorry, x equals 1. Titingin ko ito yung dalawa, ito yung original expression, ito yung kinancel na expression. Hindi sila eksaktong parehong-pareho. Kasi ito undefined sa negative sa 1. Tama? Pero ito hindi siya undefined sa x equals 1. Elsewhere, they are the same because you can cancel out. Diba? Pwede mo na siyang i-cancel out if x is not 1. So mag-i-equal na sila. So that means if you only consider this one, the only vertical asymptote you will be giving is x equals -1. So make sure, what I'm saying here is, as a precaution, make sure nothing is a common factor between the numerator and denominator. Like in this one here. Wala namang na-cancel, di ba? So, okay lang. Yun na yun. And then, horizontal asymptotes. How do we get the horizontal one? Isa lang pala, no? Anyone na? For this case? Somebody said a while ago, compare the degrees. The degree of the numerator is 1. The degree of the denominator is 2. So this falls under the case where the degree of the numerator is less. And what do we do if this is the case? Anyone?
Sir,
Yes.
sir, since the degree of the numerator is less than the degree of the denominator, then the horizontal asymptote should be y equals 0.
Correct.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
So it's always y equals 0 no matter what. Basta't yung degree ng numerator mas mababa, laging x-axis ang horizontal asymptote mo. By the way, this is not the y-axis, okay? This is the x-axis. Kasi the y coordinate is 0. So yan yung laging magiging horizontal asymptote mo. So in other words, kung mas mababa yung degree, ang dali na lang, no? Hindi mo na kailangan mag-divide. And sign chart, bigay ko na. So kunin mo lang lahat ng zeros. Tatlo yan. And then test numbers. Don't forget the zeros and NDs. There. Now, what's the difference between this example and the previous one? Let me draw the Cartesian plane and the asymptote. There's a difference, a slight difference. For this one, there are two vertical asymptotes now. So the shapes I showed you will not be enough to cover this example. And that's the portion in between the asymptotes. Now, when you're dealing with the graph, the portion of the graph in between two vertical asymptotes, if there are more than one, okay, let me give the easy way of determining already how the graph will look like. There are only 4 possibilities in between two. So let's say these are the vertical asymptotes. Okay, ibigay ko na lang yung shapes. No? Pwedeng parang parabola. It's not really a parabola. Parabolic in shape, opening upward or downward, or ganyan yung isa, or pag ganito. Depende kung saan siya mag-a-approach na asymptote. So 4 lang yan. Okay, memorize those shapes. And let's consider the sign chart now. Let me plot the points available, 1, 0, and 0, 1/2. And then, what else? Okay, asymptotes drawn. Kailangan na lang natin yung, okay, horizontal. So, 3 yun, ha? Dapat yung nakasulat para may points ka doon. Yan. And let's consider those outside the 2 vertical asymptotes there. Yung nandito, before -1, at yung nandito, after ng 2. Okay. So let's start with this part, less than -1. There are only 2 possibilities. Which one should be it? You base it on the sign chart now. the sign chart tells you it's below entirely. So you eliminate the other part. And then dito tayo muna. Only two possibilities. And you just look at the sign chart. This is after 2. So dito ka titingin, above. So delete mo lang yung isa. And then in between, so dahil nasa taas, positive, tapos dito nasa baba, at dadaan dun sa dalawang points, ito dapat yung sa apat na possibilities. Yeah. Okay, positive. So it's above. Okay, and then negative. Baba na siya. So yan yung rough sketch ng graph natin. So let's look at this sa GeoGebra. There. X equals -1, X equals 2. Those are the vertical asymptotes. And then Y equals 0 for the horizontal one. Ayan. So, seat work. And then wala tayong class sa Thursday. Consultation lang. Kung kailangan nyo ako sa Thursday, email me by Wednesday, on or before Wednesday. Okay, I want you to sketch, okay, the graph of number 24. Okay, by the way, yung case na the degree of the numerator is greater than, by the way, bago nyo gawin to, hindi nakasama yan. Halimbawa, no, yung x squared over x plus 1, if the degree of the numerator is greater than the degree of the denominator, actually, there's no horizontal asymptote. But, hindi na natin isasama yung ganitong case. And actually, meron dapat na possibility na ganito. Sana. Halimbawa, meron kang horizontal asymptote. And hindi to kasama dun sa mga shapes na pinakita ko kanina. Actually, pwedeng magkaroon ng ganitong case. Para siyang bell curve, no? Pero hindi na yan kasama. Or yung ganito. Asymptotic din siya sa magkabila. Halimbawa, yung graph ng 1 over x squared plus 1, ganyan yung itsura. But, hindi na to sasama o isasama dun sa midterms. Kaya laging yun lang. Okay? And yung in between. Yan lang yung pagpipilian nyo talaga. Okay, so I'll give you 10 minutes to work this out. Okay, so let me discuss how to really graph this one, since some of you may have canceled out the common factor there and graph as is. Okay, if you look at the numerator and denominator, x plus 1 is actually cancelable except for some values of x. Oh, okay, sorry. I thought these were x squared plus x. Okay. All right, so you just do that. Okay. You can consult me na lang kung tama yung gawa ninyo. Pero let me do this one. Sorry. How do you sketch the graph of this one? So you would begin by giving the domain. And if you look at x squared plus x, it's x times x plus 1. So the domain is the set of all real numbers except -1 and 0. And then for the intercepts, you will be equating the numerator to 0, right? Remember, you set y to 0 to get the x-intercepts. And if you cross multiply, you will eventually come up with this one. But it's not really an intercept because of this. Kinakita ko to kasi may probably lalabas na ganito na kung saan, actually mamaya makikita nyo, may hole doon sa graph. So why is this so? Because if you factor out the original expression, you'll see that x plus 1 is a common factor. So that it's equivalent to 1 over x for all values except 1. And this one has no x-intercept. If you look at 1 over x, wala siyang x-intercept. Bakit? To get the x-intercept, you set y to 0. And if you cross multiply, 0x equals 1, 0 equals 1. That's impossible. So it has no x-intercept. And then for the y-intercept, you set x to 0. And you get 1 over 0. So there's no y-intercept either. So none. And then for the vertical asymptotes, again, you will make a mistake here probably. Now, you know the procedure would be to equate this to 0, the denominator, right? And you will be giving probably x equals 0 and x equals -1 as the vertical asymptotes of the function. But this is wrong. They are not one of them. One of them is not an asymptote. And again, you will have to cancel out. Again, it's equivalent to 1 over x. Let me put it there. And if you look at this equivalent expression, definitely you see that only 0, x equals 0 is the vertical or a vertical asymptote. Isa lang. So hindi kasama lahat ng factors ng denominator kung may common factor sa numerator. Kakancel nyo muna yon. And then for the horizontal asymptote, same thing. You compare the degrees. The degree of the numerator is smaller, so it's always y equals 0. And then the sign chart. For the sign chart, okay, it would be better if you use the simplified expression, so as to avoid an additional partition number. Okay, but this is doable using the original expression. So if you look at that one, again, in factored form, so you will have two partition numbers, -1 and 0. And you would put ND. Okay, ND. And then you would have plus, minus, plus. And if you sketch the graph, so these are the asymptotes. And is there an intercept? There's no intercept. So you know there are only two possibilities at either side of the asymptote, the vertical one. And you just have to base on the sign chart. Okay. So if you look at, this is 0. Left side. Sorry, I'm wrong with the sign chart. If you look at the left side of the sign x equals 0, that tells you the graph is below. So you delete this one, eliminate that one. But take note, it's not defined at -1. So you remedy that by creating a hole or putting a hole at x equals -1. Okay, let me continue. And then you look at the sign chart at the right side of 0. So you have that. And if you sketch the graph quickly, ito siya. The graph of y equals 1 over x. I hope you're already familiar with the graph of y equals 1 over x. Asymptotic lang siya sa axis. Except that you have a hole at -1. Yan siya. Let me show using GeoGebra. So let me type in okay, did not show. There should be. Anyway, so is there any question? That's the only difference lang. Pwedeng ginaraf nyo na lang yung y equals 1 over x, and then you just put a hole at -1. Any question before we end the session? So that's it for today. Let me end the meeting.